Welcome to the All About GTM podcast, where I invite thought leaders in my network to spill the tea on everything go-to-market. I am your host, Jade Maravillas. My next guest is Jovita Tam. Jovita is the definition of a multi-hyphenate. Lawyer, engineer, change management consultant, data and responsible AI expert, and keynote speaker are just some of the many hats that she wears. Our chat reflects her unorthodox background, including the parallels between go-to-market, compliance, and change management, how to get fired by ignoring AI governance, and why culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We also talk about stand-up comedy and breaking my wrist, which sounds like it shouldn't be in this podcast about GTM. So have a listen and let me know what you think. But for now, I give you Jovita Tam. Hey, Jovita, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, it's absolutely great to be here.
Cool. So this is going to be slightly different because a lot of the people that I've interviewed or planning to interview for the podcast, I've actually worked with before or I've known for a long time. But let me tell people that Jovita is someone that I've known for the last few months, and I kind of fangirled her a little bit. I saw you at the Big Data London last year, which was a great conference, by the way. I really loved it. And I was going through the different talk tracks, and I was looking for something to sit in, and yours stood out, primarily because it was such a cheeky title. But then I sat in, and first of all, what struck me was that you're talking about an important but could be quite a bland topic, which is compliance to AI regulation. But you did it in such a way that was so engaging. But also I realized you're a lawyer with a sense of humor, which is quite a rare beast. So I said, okay, you know what? I got to know this person. And in the last few months, we've been connecting and talking. And I said, I'm launching a podcast. I know exactly who to talk to when it comes to looking at organizational change and culture, and it's you. So thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for the kind words, and thank you for having me.
So first thing I wanted to get into, I was looking into your background, but I was also looking at your LinkedIn, and it seemed like you've done a lot of different specializations that most people don't stumble upon. You're a lawyer, you're an engineer, you work in data and strategy. What's your origin story and how do you come across those specializations?
So for me, when I went to school, I think a lot of times what people tend to do is I'm going to go to engineering school because I want to be an engineer. I want to go to law school because I want to be a lawyer. So instead of looking at it like that, I more looked at the different skills that I would like to acquire. For me, kind of growing up, there's been entrepreneurs like in and out of my life, that sort of a thing. And I've always looked at it as, well, to solve a business problem, right? What are some of the skills that I might need? And, fortunately, I was relatively good at math. So as an undergrad, it made sense, right, for me to do engineering. And at the time in Canada, the University of Waterloo opened up their first class of mechatronics engineering, which was robotics. And I was like, that is right up my alley because that is a combination of various disciplines of engineering. There's mechanical, there's electrical, there's computers, there's systems design. So I was really interested in understanding how things work. And I think engineering gives me a very good background for that. Like, how do I take apart a problem? How do I put it together? It keeps me grounded and it helps me to become very practical, right? Or it just fit my personality because that's kind of who I was at the time. And in Canada at the time, you can't actually go to law school as an undergrad, unlike here in the UK where you could. So quite naturally, I was like, well, let's do the engineering piece first. But I've always wanted to go to law school because I was like, well, in this society, we all need to follow the law, right? That's essentially the rules, right? Whether it's individuals, whether it's businesses, whether it's investments or whatever, like we need to understand the law because that, in a sense, shaped the sandbox that we all play in. So afterwards, I went to law school. I spent 2 years here in London at City University, and then I furthered my education and went to UC Berkeley for my Master's of Law, where I focused much more on the corporate side of things, M&A, PE, before moving to New York. So that's how I've accumulated the various pieces over time. And I think from quite a young age, working directly with a lot of business owners, I saw that they're solving problems every single day. Whether they're seeking opportunities or whether they're literally faced with a problem that makes or breaks their business, it's not something where they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to only look at it through this lens and I'll be able to get myself out of it. You need to throw absolutely everything you've got, right? You're interacting with so many different people. You need to talk to your accountant. You need to talk to your operations manager. You need to talk to marketing. There's all of these people that are involved to get this thing done. So I've always looked at it as a skill set, and I've always looked at things as a transferable skill set. An example would be that I actually got way out of my comfort zone and signed up for a stand-up comedy course, which is about to start in 4 days. And that's because I've noticed in recent years, I'm doing more and more presentations and talks and things like that. And I'm like, well, who is best to stand in front of an audience, have absolutely, no idea. Anybody could be in the room. You got to make people laugh. That's extremely difficult. So
It is.
what is the trick of the trade? Or how do stand-up comedians look at their world and their audience and approach their work? Maybe I can learn something from that, right? And so that's what I sign up for. So it seems very eclectic, but there is a central theme to it, I guess.
That is such a brave thing to do. I've seen you talk. Obviously, I've already spoken about it. And I think you're very, not just eloquent, but you're very comfortable in front of an audience, or at least from someone who was sitting in the audience, it seemed that way. What do you think you're going to get out of this course? It's super exciting, by the way.
I think, first of all, every time I try something new, something that I haven't tried before, I learn not only the skill that, that part I have no idea what I'm going to learn. I'm very excited. But I learned something about myself, right? Being in a new environment, being in an environment that I haven't been in before, doing things I haven't been doing before is a new angle for me to look at myself. So when you say comfort level, I think we all, like when we do public speaking and we, get on stage, there is always going to be nerves. And I think it's actually a good thing. But at the same time is if you know how you're going to behave under nerves, or you're like, hey, I'm actually expecting it. It is part of the thing. This is how I know, I know how I'm going to feel about that. You can actually harness that energy and channel it, right? So I think that's when you say the level of comfort, it would be acceptance and maybe being comfortable with the fact that, hey, I am going to be nervous, versus if you sit there and go, hey, my expectation is that I'm not going to be nervous. I'm going to be all these things and you're not, or whatever, or there's a gap between kind of expectation of self and where you're at. That is when you see the speaker going like, okay, well, this person doesn't seem like themselves, right? So maybe for me, that's what it is.
There's a few things that I was thinking of when you were just talking about that. One is that I forget what hormone it is, but they say that the feeling that you have when you're nervous or anxious is the same as when you're excited. So it's really about that framing of your mindset, that if you're in front of an audience, yes, you might feel nervous or anxious, but actually that's also you trying to, go rearing in front of and talking, right?
I read that as well. And I think that that's what it is. It's about, acceptance, right? And it's about working with what there is. Because, and we started out talking about organizational change and so on. And for a while, I was much more involved with customer experience. And this is something that I would always say is like, don't sit here and say, okay, well, the customer should be behaving like this. It's like have this ideal customer, right? And I see this a lot. This person should read that 500-page disclaimer. I'm like, dude, I don't read it. Like, do you? And if you don't do it, don't sit here and talk to me about this ideal user that will do this. I much rather assume the ideal user as a person that is like, okay, you're getting in the way of what this person is looking to do. They're impatient. They don't want to do this, right? So how do you make life easier for them? How do you reduce the bad friction, but introduce friction that actually helps the customer experience? But I see some people, they get caught up in the customer should or the user should behave like this. If you're using that term, chances are they don't behave like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing I was thinking of when you were talking about it was exactly what you touched on. So going in front of an audience is sometimes daunting, but actually knowing who you're talking to makes it a lot less so.
Yeah.
And it's the same as in marketing as well, right? So it's really adapting your messaging to who you're targeting. But another thing that I thought of was people buy on emotion and justify through fact. It's a well-known, at least in my world, it's a well-known saying. And I think what you're doing is you're injecting that emotional, personal connection to a potentially dry topic and making people care about something that is really important, but in a way that is engaging, right?
Thank you for that. And I think there's a lot of similarities between your work and my work. If you look at it, you focus on go to market. And for me, I do a lot of change and transformation. But essentially, any kind of transformation you do, people, process, technology as a framework, people is the key, right? And at the end of the day, as people, we're both emotional beings and we're logical beings. We have to be able to sit here and have the numbers to show for it, to be able to provide the business justification. But at the end of the day, if the person is feeling irked about it, that gut feeling, if you would, that's like kind of telling you, no, don't do this, then it's not going to help and it's not going to go through. And I think another thing is, for me, communication is definitely a two-way thing. I might have the mic and I might be the person that's standing on stage giving a talk or whatever, but essentially there's two parts to it. It's not just what comes out of my mouth, is potentially how would it land with the audience. Obviously, I can't sit here and control how it's going to land with everybody. All I can do is sit in when I'm preparing my talk, sit here and go, if the audience is likely in this kind of bucket. So in the case of big data, if they're CDO, for example, or if they're a compliance professional, or if they're a student, or they're the everyday data citizen, chances are this is their relationship with the topic, and chances are this is what they're going to hear. So I think when I prepare this, I focus it both ways, not just what I'm saying, but sitting here trying to imagine how it's going to land. And in organizations and working with multi-stakeholder situations, it is exactly the same thing. I could sit here and I could say something. I could use all the legal jargon in the world, or I could sit here and use all the technical jargon in the world. But, well, how is it going to land with the other person? And if it's not going to land well, this is not exactly a good use of their time or my time. I'm not saying that there isn't a time and place for the specified terms. It's like, if you're talking to people, if you're within your engineering team, it goes very quickly because they have the same education, they know what that words mean. There's already that alignment. But if you're in a wider group, you can't assume that alignment makes sense. And there was one point in time where I had a client, very large organizations, and they love acronyms. Between the industry and between that organization, they love acronyms, right? But after a while, you learn that these acronyms aren't unique. And I'm like, okay, are we actually talking about the same thing? And, 15 minutes into an hour meeting, and I'm like, okay, this is feeling like you've done a translator. Something is not right. And then I'm like, all right, let me ask a very obvious question. It might sound very dumb, but we talking about this, right? And it's like, you have people looking back at you, even in a virtual call, right? And I'm just like, okay, so let's level set and start again. So I think in our work, we see a lot of similar things.
Absolutely. Let me touch on that. But first of all, recently, right, talking about acronyms and jargon, my next guest is going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, so DEI, in GTM, in go-to-market. So this was yesterday, actually. I was Googling if there were any topics or anyone talking about that DEI in GTM. So that's what I typed.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the first thing that came up was DEI, same, diversity, equity, inclusion, and global tax management. So I was like, wait, let me then just spell out what GTM, or at least I think the second one was GTM strategy. So maybe I should have clicked on that. But yeah, global tax management.
Yep. So if somebody reach out to you on LinkedIn and go, Jade, can you help me with my global tax management problem?
Yeah, I have the exact same problem. So probably not the right person to talk to about it. Okay, so you've mentioned that there's some parallels in what we do. What does Jovita actually do, considering you've done so many different things and so many different specializations? As a consultant, what do you specialize in?
I specialize in solving problems and basically innovating and doing what the client wants. It's a summary of it. But to be more specific, I'm a business-focused data and AI advisor, and I help companies and people innovate to achieve what they're looking to do. And as mentioned, I'm hyper-focused in optimizing at the intersection between data and AI, the law, and the technical aspects of the business. And much more recently, I've been in data governance for a number of years, working with data and leading transformations and the like, but I'm very passionate about AI governance. So increasingly, I've been devoting more and more of my energy towards that. And I want people to understand that AI governance is not an afterthought. This is not something where you build your technology solution, you deploy it, and then you think about it later. It is not just about regulatory compliance. So it's not just because the law is asking me to do XYZ, therefore that's my governance program. It really is about balancing between responsible AI and managing your AI risk. And the reason why we do this is because we want to enjoy this benefit of what the technology brings, and so we can continue to innovate.
As I mentioned, I met you after your Big Data London talk, and the title was how to get fired by ignoring AI
Ignoring AI
governance, which is, again, as I mentioned, really catchy, and that's what draw me into going and like queuing up for that packed audience, right? So can you give me some examples on what the consequences are for ignoring regulation in general, but even specifically the way that people use AI nowadays and it being a very newly regulated industry?
So I would say that you can look at it from different perspectives, right? Obviously, from a regulatory perspective, there are now regulations out there. And later this year, I think in 2025 with the EU AI Act, I forgot the exact date, but for non-compliance, there's a fine element, there's all of that goes on. As a business, of course, you're going to have, if you show up on the front page in the wrong way, right? You're obviously going to end up with your reputational damage and the like. And these days, I've seen a lot of companies, they're very diligent with their own use cases in collecting them to figure out, okay, what we're going to use AI for. They test it. They have a very great system and they're working it through systematically. But simultaneously, because these days you always like have a software from another vendor, right? Because it doesn't make sense. Like you're not in the business of, like, for example, building your HR software, building all these software for yourself. So you would be engaging with a vendor, and many of the vendors in the last while has very aggressively incorporated AI into their features, or it's become a part of their product, and you can't turn it off. So what happens is that you now end up having more AI within your organization as part of your everyday business process than you think it is. But the reality is, okay, so you're going to leverage technology to help you make a certain kind of decision. And these are decisions that impact people's lives in many cases. And so if there's an undesirable, decision, you didn't mean for it to happen, right? But if you trace it up the line and you're like, oh, my business process actually inevitably changed with this now embedded in my process, then you're going to potentially face the consequences, right? You may have unhappy customers, reputational damage. You could even incur legal liability, depending on what it is. The legislation in many cases are still rolling out. So we don't have a full picture of it. We're in the beginning of the journey. But essentially, you can look at it as there's a financial damage, there's legal kind of a damage, but it is the idea of you have a very powerful tool. You could use that very powerful tool to deliver all the benefits to you, or you now also, the flip side of it is you have a shovel with rocket fuel. If you don't do it right, you're going to be digging a hole for yourself very damn quickly, right? So there are many, many scenarios. And I think part of it is I'm like, pretty loud advocate in this area about responsible use of this. Is it's not about stopping. We have to move forward, but it's about how can we move forward in a more mindful kind of a way. How can we move forward by being more aware of this risk? And the thing is, technology is changing, social expectation is changing, and our capability to manage this is also increasing over time. How do I help my future self when the technology is available, when a new kind of thinking is available to help mitigate this risk? Is by me being very clear from the very beginning of what I'm doing, why I'm doing, and in many cases, documenting it. So it's one thing if you have like, oh, a guy put it together, absolute genius. And then 5 years down the road, the guy's left the company, whatever. And you're sitting here going like, well, I actually have no idea what happened. And we see this in transformation a lot is it probably made sense when this was implemented, or it was implemented for a specific reason based on the context at the time and what they're looking to achieve at the time. But as we move forward, well, we don't see that context anymore. We don't experience that context anymore. What remains is that thing, right? So it makes it much more difficult if we're not doing everything we can now to help our future self.
One of the things that you mentioned there, which has been plaguing my mind lately, maybe nothing to do with GTM, but maybe it does actually. So, how do you as a company comply with AI regulation when, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the AI that's being used isn't what you're implementing yourself? So, it's software, or it might be your employees using general AI tools like ChatGPT, for instance, right? How can a company make sure that they're using AI responsibly when it's not their data or they're using someone else's product?
I think that's a very, very good question. And it's one that a lot of people are looking to solve. I don't think I have like a very good answer for you or a very comprehensive answer for you, because this is still going to unfold over time. But there are definitely things that we can do. And you mentioned responsible AI. And well, I think for many companies, I think it's important for them to explore that area on their own and figure out, well, what does responsible AI mean for you? Like, because ultimately, and I said this in the Big Data London talk, is you need to have your North Star when you do this, because a lot of these things are still in flux. And what is my example of Big Data London is like, well, what's a responsible time for going to bed? Are you a 5-year-old, 15-year-old, a 35-year-old, 85-year-old? Do you do shift work, like morning shift, graveyard shift? So seemingly, we all agree that it needs to be responsible deployment of AI. But for each of the organization, they have to figure out what that means for them. Again, this is not one of those put a pin on it, but have a range. And this is why culture matters, is because you can't sit here and write everything down. But if you trust that, okay, this collective group of people all have this sense of shared values, then that is a start for a lot of these things. And to your point about how can you know that you're compliant, I would say the starting point, right, is know what you have. It's important to have the mindset of this is something I don't want people to be like very fearful of, oh my God, like this is just going to be so much cost, so much whatever. But it's the idea of you approach it with a certain level of caution and you sit here and you go, okay, well, let's start off by knowing what we have as a minimum kind of a starting point, because that would give you the ability then to assess risk. And then you can think about mitigation, then you can think about a lot of these. And in terms of what you said about compliance, do look at the regulations out there. There are a lot of them. I think that the EU AI Act is, obviously, we're both sitting in the UK right now. A lot of us touch a European market. It is a very key piece of legislation. It does take a risk-based approach and is highly focused on the high-risk area. I think it is very informative. Now, it's not about going in there and like, just complete plug and play, but it is about working with a professional who understands this and going in there and go, okay, what is relevant, right? With this thinking, what could we possibly be doing? Now, there will be things that fall very squarely within that area, and then you need to put together a much more structured program. But ultimately, it is an iterative process. It's not about, okay, I'm going to put in a program today. I know I'm going to be compliant. We are learning as we move along. But I think So the first thing is have the sense of guardrail in your mind when you start. And I also mentioned this during the Big Data London talk, is know where you are in the AI value chain. It does make a huge difference. And because it is already embedded in much of our processes, chances are you're going to be wearing a different hat, or you're going to be at a different part of the value chain depending on what the thing is. Right. And ultimately, I do think that prioritization is key. I don't think it's realistic for those medium and smaller size businesses to sit here and go, okay, well, I'm going to do this, build this, and like keep iterating. I understand that there's a business that they need to run, but at the same time, it's not one of those do once and forget about it. And it's sort of like once you learn how to ride a bike, you get the philosophy of it. You can always hop on the bike. Just know that the bike is there. You got to, work it every once in a while. And that's why after the initial learning curve, it keeps paying off.
Just thinking of what you said about learning and riding the bike. I have a 6-year-old who is an excellent cyclist now, but when we were trying to teach her, there was a lot of stumbles upon the way, and then she got it, and now it's just, and like with myself, it's second nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the last couple of years, I've actually gotten into 2 cycling accidents.
Ooh.
Because, yeah, all good. I'm still alive.
Yeah.
The only, I've had a few bruises. I've had like a chipped tooth, which you can't really tell right now. And I've also like broken my wrist. So not a good thing. But I was also thinking when you were saying it, right? First, you're learning, and then it becomes second nature. But then you get too confident in it that you forget the risks, right? You forget that you actually, just because you're doing so well in it doesn't mean that there won't be other stumbles upon the way.
Yeah.
And so I can see some parallels in that, where you're like, oh, you know what? We're trying to figure out how we use AI responsibly. We'll adapt that into frameworks within our organization, and then we use it and it becomes second nature. But then there will always be risks of it, I don't know, stumbling upon the wayside or falling off that proverbial bike that you need to think about, right?
Yeah. And that's why, depending on the size of that organization, again, where they're in the AI value chain, that is why we have in an organization, we have different people being responsible for different parts of it, right? So while the majority of the organization is going out there using this technology and deploying it, I think there's a general level of data and AI literacy, right? Which helps people understand how this works, their relationship with it, which they refine over time. And as you refresh that, hopefully you avoid that overconfident situation. But you also have individuals within organizations where it is more of their responsibility to scan the marketplace, scan how things evolve, so that they manage that risk and change as the context change, as the technology changes, and so on. And I think what you said about the bike is like, thank you for bringing that up, because I was thinking you learn it, but yeah, you do get to the point of overconfidence, and then sometimes things happen. That's the thing with AI governance. It's definitely has brought many companies benefit. A lot of companies are struggling with it simultaneously, but again, as I said, it's not about not moving forward, but it's about having something at the back of your mind that, as great as this thing is, you could break your wrist if you don't handle it properly. So
Absolutely. So this is a GTM podcast, and we've been talking a lot about AI and AI governance, which is a topic that's also close to my heart, as I was in a startup a few months ago that focused on this. But going back into GTM, from where you're sitting as someone who's worked with many, many companies in a lot of different industries, how have you seen these companies leverage AI in their go-to-market, both strategy but also implementation?
to be honest, I don't know if I'm in the best position to answer that question, because we're still at a stage where different companies have very different susceptibility around AI, right? So clearly when, Gen AI first rolled out, there's a lot of companies that have this prohibitive view. You cannot use this. But things have changed, and I know that companies have moved on. It's one thing to have company policy, and the other thing is, I'm sure there are people that when they're in the off time, they'll have a casual chat with one of the Gen AIs to brainstorm together. So I think To your point, I think that there's definitely brainstorming that people are using it for. I think there are certain tasks where it's just faster to get a template. The danger here is that I heard this analogy being used. ChatGPT or, any of these Gen AI things is like a teenager. It thinks that it understands it, but it doesn't really have that depth of domain knowledge unless you cue it properly, and judgment is still something that's TBD. The other thing is that you would have the domain professionals leveraging it for brainstorming. There's some productivity improvement with it, but you probably also have other individuals who are not in that domain leveraging that as like a quick learning tool. So you sit here and just go Google this, like what are other people doing? So in a sense, I do feel like there are some positive benefits that have come out of this, right? Which is that you have people going, okay, well, in a shorter amount of time, I can have a better understanding of this so that people can come to the meeting a little bit more prepared. But if you misuse it, then the thing is like people feel like they're experts and you're like, not quite.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've seen firsthand within the industry, but also it's all over the news, this whole scaremongering that, oh, it's AI is getting so good that it's going to take our jobs. And as a marketer, I feel like marketing is such a, not just it being a volatile industry or role, regardless of AI or not, because ultimately, and this is, I think it's a wrong way of thinking about it, but a lot of senior management do think about, hey, we're going into a recession. We need to cut people. What are the roles that we could cut? And marketing being seen as a spending part of the organization is probably one of the first to go. And with AI advancements, especially in different facets of marketing, whether it's content generation or it is bringing your profile into search a lot more, there's a lot of backlash for marketers where it can help you speed things up or give you like additional assistance in the menial tasks that you don't really want to do, but also a lot of companies thinking about, well, and I think, was it Klarna that was in the news lately where they were like, well, actually, you know what? We're going to displace quite a number of roles because AI is just going to be able to do that. So where does the balance lie between having that human oversight, which is absolutely needed, to outsourcing things to these advanced technologies?
So for me, I always advocate for human in the loop, right? And that is also a very key element in, the EUAI Act is, and I think this goes back to what I was saying about companies and having vendor embedded AI and it's now part of your business process. In that case, the company is responsible for the decision that's being made. But in the case, like same thing is, well, a human is responsible, right? It doesn't help if you sit here and go, well, it was the technology. At the end of the day, it is still just a tool. And I think when you mention that, it is a concern in many different cases. And you see it not just in marketing, but in other industries as well. Is with the economy in the recent years, there's a lot of talks about cost cutting. But there's a difference between cutting cost versus cutting an investment. And are you truly able, or some of the business leaders truly able to distinguish between the two, right? If you are genuinely cutting costs without negatively impacting the organization, that's one thing. If you're increasing efficiency, increasing effectiveness. But if you're cutting on investment and wondering why this thing isn't growing, or you're hollowing the organization from the inside out because you're cutting in areas that really needs that resource, that's a different thing. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing, which is very much a risk that comes with, I think, generative AI as a technology is that, or the power of this technology, it does make a lot of things quicker. And for the most part, it does do a reasonable job. So I know that a lot of people would take a large PDF or whatever, they'll feed it into one of these apps and then make it give you a summary, right? Now, most of the time, the summary is relatively good enough. But if you think about how we do this over time, I'm all for fit for purpose, But if it's good enough, we're slightly off, we're slightly off, we're slightly off. Not only does our ability to be able to synthesize information go down because we don't practice it. And it is a luxury to be able to sit here and like sift through pages and pages of stuff, don't get me wrong. But it's like we need to keep in mind that if we keep doing this, are we now moving forward going to be functioning in a world where the detail matter less and less, right? And at which point do you hit this kind of critical mass and be like, this is too much?
Yeah. I mean, whatever happens, like any tool or any decision we take will always have consequences, whether good or bad. So I spoke a little bit about marketing there, but as I'm quite passionate about go-to-market isn't just about marketing. It's a common misconception, I would say. So go-to-market, as I've written in my latest blog post, really cuts across different parts of the organization. And when we talk about go-to-market, it really is about market readiness and being able to understand the customer that you're serving within that market repeatedly. So it's not just a one and done. In your world, which touches more on strategy, data, regulation, legal side, I personally think as someone who's worked with these functions as well, that is absolutely crucial to bring them in when you start thinking about going into a new market. So from your experience working with some organizations within the change and organizational management space, what are some of the things that companies typically overlook when it comes to these functions going into a new market?
Before I begin, I want to like ask you this. It's like I did read your blog post and I absolutely loved it. It'd be great if you can maybe quickly go over your framework with
Yeah.
with us.
Okay. All right. Putting me in the spotlight. So just a couple of minutes on it. I wrote about my experience when I was at a payments company called Dojo, and I joined just before, I think they were already seeing a lot of organic growth within the industry, within the payments industry. But it was just at the cusp between that to really rocket ship growth, right? They had a great proposition, a great product, which was groundbreaking at that time. And they had amassed a number of small to medium businesses as their customers and a few larger or enterprise customers because the product and the proposition was so strong. I joined to help build the enterprise sales team because they wanted to sell to more of these customers. And when I joined, I realized that they didn't really need an enterprise sales team because they had 600 payment consultants or independent sales agents around the company. So they already had a distribution. What they needed was to understand that first, enterprise wasn't a channel. It was a new segment of the market. And speaking to a lot of different parts of the business, I realized that except for a couple of teams, everyone still had serving an SMB customer in mind. So it was really difficult to go into a new market segment without first understanding who that customer, the new customer is, which in this case is a larger customer, right? Not only is larger in terms of transactions or revenue, but also the decision-making, the actual operations, the way that there's different parts of the customers' businesses that we needed to appeal to. And that wasn't really translating into the rest of the organization. So personally, what I needed to do was evangelize on behalf of that customer, get the whole organization to understand that we are now going into this new market. Therefore, within, say, onboarding, compliance, credit risk, customer support, the product itself, the data hierarchies and the engineering that needed to shift in relation to that particular customer. So that experience really gave me this evangelical point of view that if we're really going to market and we're doing it properly, it's not just about getting a sales team or asking marketing to do a campaign for this new type of customer. It's really understanding that this new customer is going to be central to your organization's strategy, right?
And I think so. It's very interesting, right? Because as you say that, I feel that there's a lot of similarities. Because what I heard is that you go in and there's almost like an expectation that, okay, this is your role, this is what we want you to deliver on. But as you speak to more people, take a much broader approach, like more end-to-end process approach, you realize that what you've been tasked with may not be the best fit to get to the outcome. And that's because maybe people had a certain perception of what your skill set can deliver and what your knowledge and expertise fit into the wider process, right? And that's something that I definitely resonate with. As you said, no, I'm not a typical lawyer and I take pride in that. But ultimately, it's like I have the skill set and you have your skill set. We know how we can best deploy this skill set. But it happens with legal a lot, or legal and compliance function a lot, is that sometimes they're being seen as business prevention, which is understandable, right? Because there are colleagues of mine which takes a different view, or different, it's not so much view, I think it's the approach. They have the idea that, okay, let's say no first. But because I come from a very strong consulting background, I come from the angle of how can I help? How do we move this forward? How do we get this done? It doesn't mean that I would compromise my professional judgment, but ultimately it's about we're on the same team pushing this forward. But instead of, like, a lot of times you would have people coming to go, okay, I expect legal, regulatory compliance or whatever to provide X. And then they'll just give you what they think you need to deliver on what they're asking for. But as you learn the big picture, you're like, that's not really it, right? I think that there's definitely a lot of, similarities there. And I think organization culture, how decisions are made, how collaborations actually happen across the organization makes a huge difference when it comes to how these different professionals and teams come and work together.
One thing you touched on was culture, organizational culture. And I remember you've said this a couple of times, both in the talk, but also when we've spoken, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I love that. Also, it's making me hungry right now. So I might have like an early lunch right after this. First of all, what do you mean by that? I get it, but I'd love for you to expound on it. Also, how would you then relate that to influencing a go-to-market motion across an organization?
So what I mean by that is that I think a number of years ago, driven by a lot of management consulting firms, perhaps in certain industries, there's the constant push of have a strategy, have a strategy, have a strategy. Now, I think it's extremely important to have a strategy, and different people have different understanding and interpretation of what a strategy is, because I think it's important for us to be able to make decisions in a consistent kind of a way. But with some organizations, what happens in certain cases is that things looks like it's a constellation in the sky. You're aiming for this, you're aiming for that, and like you have things everywhere. But ultimately, I think this also comes down to the idea that we're humans and we're both logical and emotional. As I said, we can sit here, have a strategy, and we can be aligned with it. We can have a lot of corporate jargons and all those things around it. All of these things are great, but every day when we're in that environment, in the environment that we work in, we feel how decisions are being made. And in essence, the culture is the context. I think that having strategy, again, is very important, because I know that it's infinitely frustrating when things keep changing and, everybody's aiming at different things. But if you just sit here and think that you're done with it once you have a strategy and neglect how it doesn't fit with culture of the organization, how decisions are actually being made, then you're going to go nowhere, right? So I think that that's what I mean by culture strategy for breakfast, lunch, dinner, 2 snacks and desserts. You really have to focus on the human element of it and not just sit here and go, I have all the hard facts, I have the data, I have whatever. Why isn't this working? And this is, to me, a very interesting part about working on transformations is, well, what is the difference between, you being able to influence somebody versus you're not able to influence somebody, whether it's senior management, whether it's peer, investor. You have to keep in mind that there is that unspoken culture, which is all around us. It's not about, I have this stat, you now have to do it. That never works.
No, you can't really force someone. I think what I've seen is that a lot of people, as you rightly said, they come up with a strategy, think it's the most groundbreaking, the coolest thing on ice, and then try to get other people to do it from top down and without really understanding what the current processes are, but also the different challenges are within those specific roles and jobs to be done. It kind of always falls flat, right? So you need to bring people in to those discussions across the org when building that strategy so that first they feel like they're part of the creation of it, but second, it is also embedded into not just what they need to do, but how they do it as well.
Yeah. And it goes back to the idea of communication is both ways. It's great. I think having a strategy is crucial, but at the same time is, well, not just you have a strategy, is how is it actually landing with everybody within the organization? Because ultimately, each day, each person, as they're going through their role, they're constantly making decisions. Those decisions going to be aligned with where you're heading with your strategy, or are they not going to be aligned? And some decisions we're very conscious that we're making, but there are also so many other decisions that we're not making it consciously. We're making it, I don't want to say autopilot, but it's human body, our minds is absolutely brilliant, right? And this is where culture comes in. If this is the culture, then you just keep rolling it along. And that's why I think education and communication is very important. And going back to your point about marketers and go-to-market professionals being very volatile, the challenge that I've seen is, I've had the privilege of working with some great marketing professionals, is that like everybody sort of feel like in today's world that they can do marketing, but when you have actually worked with people that are really good at it, you're like, oh wow, this is actually marketing. It is something very, very different. It's perhaps people not understanding that, which is leading to the challenges, leading to perhaps the go-to-market professional not getting brought in, right, to lead or to work alongside the process from end to end. So you come in at the end, you came out. And I remember in your article, you wrote about the last mile of it, right? Just like legal and compliance and go-to-market shouldn't be the last mile. You shouldn't have built this whole thing and be like, make it compliant. It was like, that's not the way it works. I think this is also the other thing is traditionally certain roles are being seen as, oh, okay, well, they're more of a cost center. So it costs the company to do this. But I think if leveraged correctly, all expertise can be very business focused and can add to the process. And I think more and more people need to recognize that.
Great. I have like 500 other questions for you, Jovita, but I'm looking at the time and it's gone by really quickly. So thank you so much for joining me. I've learned so much. I had other questions about marketing and data, with data being your domain, but let's park it for another discussion. So hopefully we can do it again. Before we end, where can people find you?
I'm quite active on LinkedIn, so look me up, Jovita Tam. Yeah, just send me requests, DM if you want to chat.
And I can vouch for that. She's very open. I've done the same thing and look at where we are now. So thank you so much. And hopefully I get to see you in person again soon. Hopefully before the next Big Data London.
Likewise, and thank you so much for having me. And likewise, I have many questions for you, but maybe we'll just take that offline.
I highly suggest you also have a great story, a great voice. Definitely, if there was a Jovita podcast, sign me up as a guest.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for listening. If you like that episode, please consider subscribing. Read my blog at www.newmarketgtm.com and follow me on LinkedIn under New Market GTM. In our next episode, I'll be talking to a creative director on how to incorporate storytelling in your brand messaging. So please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. See you for the next one.